most academic writing advice is rubbish. And the problem often is that many people think that just because they've finished a PhD or published a few papers, that they know how to teach it. But this is like thinking that doing a few marathons qualifies you as a running coach. You might have some experience and a few insights worth sharing, but that's not the same as expertise. And often people will just repeat the same cliched statements. So things like, writing is thinking, which sounds profound, but is actually meaningless. Or just get words down on the page, which tells you nothing about writing with skill and causes huge problems if you do too much without editing. Or they'll say that you should say everything 3 times, which is completely unnecessary if you know how to structure your writing properly, and really patronizing to the reader if you keep repeating the same thing. But the problem is that much of this advice is very memorable and very easy to repeat. So it spreads far more easily than more nuanced advice about what is a fairly complicated skill, or rather set of skills. And because this advice spreads, and because people who seem to have done well repeat it, the advice gains prominence and authority far beyond its actual value. Some of the advice out there is so bad that it's clear they haven't given it any thought at all. So I heard one supposed expert on YouTube say that the way to write a PhD thesis is literally, and they used that word, to not allow anything to stop your fingers moving as fast as they can across the keyboard until you have a complete draft. And this falls apart if you think about it for more than a few seconds. Because, first of all, it is impossible to maintain the same writing pace all the time. And to try to do so just adds extra pressure when you're already stressed. Second, if you're an academic writer, if you're trying to present novel ideas to an expert audience, isn't it worth thinking a little bit about what you want to say? Isn't it worth maybe checking your notes or reading what you've written to remind yourself of what you've already said so you don't repeat it unnecessarily? Or isn't it worth maybe slowing down to take some care over certain points, or to consider your options and make a decision? Now, whenever I say this, people always bring up the issue of perfectionism as a justification for writing without thought. But what is often called perfectionism is usually indecision, stemming from a lack of confidence. And writing as fast as you can is a way of avoiding this problem in the short term, but all it does is save up all of the difficult decisions for later when you'll be under the most time pressure. And this is one of the reasons why so many people struggle to finish. Now, because there is nuance to everything, it might be a useful exercise to try writing as fast as you can for 20 minutes or so, just to see what happens. And it can have some limited utility in some specific circumstances. But to say that it's what you should do as a default, that it's the only thing you should do until you have a complete draft, to me, it's a classic example of how smart people can sometimes say or believe really stupid things. And it's a clear sign that they simply don't understand the different skills involved in writing. Another problem is that while this is the advice they often give, it's not actually what they do. So this same person also said in a different video that they agonized over every word while writing their own thesis. So maybe they think they should have written as fast as possible because it's what they've heard other people say, but it's not actually based on any real experience or insight. Now, when I started coaching after my last postdoc finished back in 2010, I definitely gave some bad advice. And part of the reason was that there were things that were instinctively easy or obvious to me, because I do have some natural aptitude for writing. So I didn't necessarily understand what other people struggled with. There were also things that I did without being really aware of what I was doing or how. So I was definitely guilty of either not being able to explain certain things, or trying to get people to do things the way that I did before they had the necessary skills. So for example, I always edit as I go, but this doesn't cause me any problems because I can hold the overall structure in my head while I think about the details. And I also know how to quickly consider different options, make a decision, and move on. But most people can't do that. But despite these early mistakes, I never stopped thinking about and refining my approach through thousands of hours of talking to students from all over the world and from every academic field, learning from them what they go through, seeing how they struggled, and then adapting my advice accordingly, not just basing everything on my own experience. And even though I can now say with some confidence that I'm by far the best in the world at what I do, I continue to learn and refine my ideas because if you're going to take on the responsibility of trying to help people, and sometimes quite vulnerable people, I personally believe that you should apply the same level or more of effort and care and critical thinking to your advice as you do to your academic work. You should spend time talking to students, working with them through the process, learning what they go through, and figuring out different solutions or subtle adaptations for different people in different circumstances and with different needs. And those needs, of course, might change over time and then require further adaptation. So you should question not only the accepted wisdom, but also your own beliefs. You should think about nuance and you should choose your words very carefully because this stuff affects people's lives. It is easy to churn out a YouTube video or run a one-day workshop and say, just keep getting words down on the page and edit it later. And it might give students a short-term boost, but then what? I know for a fact that when students struggle to follow your advice, you never hear from them because they blamed themselves. Because you're the expert. You must know what you're talking about. So if the advice doesn't work, students think they are the problem. So if you're giving writing advice, you don't have to agree with my way of doing things. There should be different approaches. And my way is certainly not the only way. But you've got to think about your approach. If you're going to say, keep writing without editing until you have a complete draft, do you mean that literally? Or is there some nuance to it? And when you come back to edit that mass of writing, how exactly do you do it? What are the principles of structure that you use? And how do you cope with difficult sections? In other words, how do you make that transition from careless to meticulous writing? You also have to be aware of the difficulties that people might face with your approach, meaning you have to seek real and varied experience of what others go through, not just seek your own short-term validation through likes and subscribes. And if you're a PhD student, you should be skeptical about the writing advice that you hear. The reason so many people struggle with writing is because the typical approaches just don't work very well. So if you try something and it doesn't work for you and you end up more stressed, the problem might not be you. It might be that the advice you've been given is lacking some important detail or nuance. Or maybe the advice you've been given is just wrong.